You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to Radio MMT. How are you, Anne?
Hello, Kevin, and hello to our lovely listener. Thanks for joining us for another hour of economics for the rest of us.
Economics, joy, oh joy. What a way to end the week. Just as you're about to wind down for the week after a heavy week, just a bit of relaxing macroeconomics to set you up for the weekend.
Now, you won't believe this. I'm extra pleased to see you today, Kevin.
Yeah? Oh, that's right. Yeah, because there was a chance I mightn't have been. I've been away and I had to rely on
There was a chance you might have been stuck in traffic.
Yes, in the air. I don't know if you can get stuck in the air. Anyway, no, the airlines were good, and I've come back because I've been doing an Ed Cooper gig, who does the theme music for our show.
Yes.
And Ed's heading he's having a renaissance. He's playing exceptionally well, and he has a really good band, and the crowd's all loving it. Although I was doing a show last night, and I had assistance from the house lighting tech, and I was talking about his console. And I said, oh, yeah, I operated the first version of this console. And he said, when was that? And it was almost 20 years before he was born.
Bet our ancient history never goes astray.
Yeah, I knew how to operate the old one, but I didn't know how to operate the new one. So I had to
Are you updated now?
No, I'm trying to get there. What's on the show for this week, Anne?
Okay, well, yes. So
statistics, I believe you mentioned something about.
Well, it's even worse than that.
Yeah.
I hate to say this word because I remember whenever I heard this word being talked about on the news or whatever, it was just an excuse to change the channel at that point. Inflation. Stick with us. Don't switch channels yet, because inflation is something that everyone's experiencing at the moment that we haven't experienced for quite some decades. And just to give you a sense of the numbers on this, over the past 12 months, overall inflation peaked at 8%, rents peaked at 7%, new houses peaked at 20%, not a good time to build a house.
No.
Electricity peaked at 14% and food at 7%. So if you feel like you're having trouble paying your bills, you're not imagining it.
If inflation is running at 8% and it's been running at, say, 2%, which it has been previous, it's now running 4 times hotter than it was before.
Yeah, so it's noticeable. And it's not just the numbers. What really fascinates me about inflation is the public debate around these numbers, the public debate around the fact of inflation, because there is a lot at stake here. And it boils down to, should the federal government be spending more or should the federal government be spending less? So unsurprisingly, inflation becomes a real political football.
I was having a bit of a listen to the Japanese situation on the way back today.
Yes.
And I think there's an interesting comparison to be made there, but we'll come to that later on.
Yeah, Japan's always an interesting case. So you really need your MMT glasses on to filter for all the nonsense that gets talked about around inflation. And remember, MMT really focuses on inflation because we do say that the federal government cannot run out of Australian dollars. But when we say that, don't hear that we're saying the federal government can spend as many dollars as it wants. You can only spend if there's stuff to buy. And if you spend beyond the stuff to buy, that's when you'll start getting inflation. And so that's where they talk about there being a limit on the spending the government can do. So government spending does get the finger wagged at it. But inflation is a very strange beast. It's probably not what you think. And so we're actually going to spend the next 2 shows, Kevin, talking about inflation.
Well, yeah, to understand inflation, you need to understand, well, we need to understand what factors are driving inflation. Like if you say inflation's running at 8%, what does that include and what doesn't that include?
Exactly.
You know?
And we'll hear about that as we speak with our guest today.
Yeah.
So Andy is a friend of the show and data analyst by profession, and he is definitely someone who can steer us in the right direction when it comes to understanding inflation. And hopefully by the end of this episode, then we'll be ready for the next show in which we will face our greatest fear, Kevin.
What's that?
Hyperinflation.
Hyperinflation.
It's always a fun one. But we'll have Andy's steady hand to guide us as we go surfing the big waves. So shall we head into our conversation with Andy?
Let's go.
Well, at a public workshop called Rethinking Capitalism, which was hosted by our friends at modernmoneylab.org.au, that Kev and I met today's guest, who we are delighted to welcome back to Radio MMT. Andy, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Kev. It's great to be back.
We got talking with you, Andy, and you mentioned, I think, more than once that inflation is a really important topic at the moment. Why do you think it is so important to take a good hard look at inflation?
Well, it's a bit hard not to look at it, isn't it? It's kind of running our lives for the recent few years. It's important for a number of reasons. In some sense, people are going through a phase of their lives that they've never gone through before. We haven't had an inflation event like this for, a generation really, not since the 90s. So for a lot of people, it's the first time they're experiencing something like this. And it's the first time that they've actually had to think about what is inflation, what are the risks, and what drives it. Is it actually telling us the things that we think it's telling us? I mean, I was born just before an event of hyperinflation. I was a toddler, but certainly my family have been through, the Yugoslav hyperinflation crisis was pretty dramatic, and certainly put my family's perspective in context in terms of what inflation is and how it sort of interacts with society. And for a lot of people in Australia, it's mainly mythology. It's sort of, it's things that they've heard about, things that they've seen on TV, Weimar Republic. So it's interesting that people have now lived through and are still living through a significant event.
Probably something we should do along the line here is look at the difference between inflation and hyperinflation. So you're describing that your own family has lived through a hyperinflationary episode. And of course, that's pretty damn traumatic, because even just regular old inflation can leave its scars. And Kevin and I probably remember the inflation of the 1970s. And I can definitely remember my mother coming home and saying, I can't believe the cost of food at the moment. It just keeps going up.
The characteristic of inflation is that it tends to undermine people's confidence in the currency. They like their currency to be stable, and when things start fluctuating, they start losing faith in what they're using.
It's very unsettling.
Very scary thing for people if what they're spending suddenly starts changing and they don't know why.
Yeah, so like at the moment, we're definitely feeling that pinch of rising prices because rents and mortgages are going up and groceries are costing more at the supermarket. So I'm wondering, Andy, if maybe we can define some of our terms, as in what do we mean by inflation? What is inflation? What does this have to do with the rising cost of living?
Sure. They're related terms, and in many cases they're indistinguishable. So inflation is an increase in average price. That's what it is. For a particular category of goods and services. When we talk about inflation generally, we're just talking about all goods and services. Inflation typically is defined through a rise in the CPI, so the Consumer Price Index. So the Consumer Price Index is published by the Bureau of Statistics monthly and looks at basically a basket of goods and services. So the ABS publishes about 87 different categories of goods and service. Everything that people consume in their daily lives, food, clothing, rent, energy, or furniture, all that stuff. So basically everything that is a consumer good or service, and looks at the growth in average price.
Now, can this be true? Something I came across was that the CPI basket contains over 100,000 different items.
It actually includes many more than that.
Wow. I thought it had like about 3 things in it, like bread and milk.
Yeah, certainly food is a big one, but the vast majority of what we purchase are actually services. So this basket's a fairly metaphoric concept, stuff like electricity, water. So this basket, it looks to track how the price of that basket goes up over time. So the cost of living typically is defined as the cost of maintaining your standard of living. There's the concept of a standard of living, which essentially just is if you maintain what you consume in terms of its quality and its quantity, then that's considered maintaining your standard of living. And the CPI essentially measures the cost of doing that. And so if the CPI is going up faster, it means that most people, of course, tend to cut back.
So when they're talking about the standard of living going up or down, the CPI figures are fed into that.
Yeah, that's right. So the Bureau of Statistics publishes a series called the Living Cost Index. It's very related to the CPI and it's derived from the same data, but what it does is it actually packages up a separate basket for different groups in society so that you have a different basket for example, employees, a different one for pensioners. And so you can kind of see that, for example, there are certain goods and services that are going up in price faster than others, and that affects the people that consume those things. Pensioners may be in care, so they don't have the energy cost as much, whereas energy affects people living in households. So you get a better picture of who's actually getting affected by inflation. So cost of living, it's a relative term. People think of inflation as this monolithic sort of hand that sweeps over hitting everyone, but it's quite different depending on what it is that you consume, where you are in society. There's a concept called underlying inflation, and a lot of commentators recently have talked about this thing called underlying inflation rather than the CPI, and that's trying to differentiate between periods of transitory supply shortages leading to price spikes in certain things. So there are things that will be going up rapidly for reasons that are temporary. During a flood event, you might have a price spike in vegetables because certain things are grown in that region. So think bananas in 2011.
I do remember the bananas of 2011.
We all lived through it. We all carry the scars. And then on the other end, you'll have things that are decreasing dramatically. Most often, it's because they went up the previous year, so they've gone down again.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
With all these hundreds of thousands of items that we're looking at, what are those measurements saying about what's causing the latest round of inflation, which of course is what everyone is all up in arms about?
So when we talk about what's driving inflation, I guess most broadly you can divide it into supply side inflation and demand side. So when people are talking about supply side, they mean inflation driven by shortage. In other words, things are more scarce. As supply drops, prices go up. And the other side is the demand side, which is where there is more demand for goods and services, usually because people have more money from governments handing out more money. So there are signatures to these types of inflation which give you a very good clue as to what it is. So at the moment, what we have is an inflation profile that looks very, there's a lot of disparity between the growth rates in prices for different things. You've got double-digit growth for certain commodities. Rents are going up really quickly. Certain categories of food, energy. You've got other things that are dropping. For example, clothing is going down, holidays and accommodation. So, you'll have some things going up. You'll probably have more things going up than down on average in a supply side inflation event, but you'll have some things going down and they'll be going down potentially dramatically at the same time. So it's quite a rich picture during a supply side event. In a demand side inflation event, you kind of have the opposite. You have a lot of uniformity in terms of where prices are going.
Right.
If businesses know that everyone's getting a massive pay rise, or they're getting their pensions doubled or their welfare doubled, well, they're all going to raise their prices regardless of what their supply situation is. Every industry is going to increase its prices. Every product is going to go up. You're not going to have some things going down and other things going up. So we don't see that at all with the current inflation profile.
That's surprising, isn't it? A lot of people wouldn't expect that prices are dropping anywhere at the moment.
Well, that's right. And this is one of the things that inflation is not this monolithic thing that affects everything at the same time. it often is very disparate in its impact on different goods and services based on their supply chains, based on their production processes. A lot of supply chains are quite complex and interlinked, and others are completely separate and have nothing to do with each other. So a supply side inflation event is one where you have particular supply shortages in key goods and services driving the whole of inflation. There are certain classes of goods and services that have a lot of weight in that basket that help to push the whole of inflation up. So in the 70s and 80s, it was the oil price. And that single-handedly hit so many supply chains that you were getting the whole of inflation hitting double digits.
Just on the oil situation there, my antenna's up on this one because I'm kind of interested in the feedback loops that happen with inflation. The oil supply problems in the 70s did underwrite the inflation that came afterwards, and it was then followed by a wage price spiral. And call me simplistic, but I'm driving around in my truck, and when inflation seems to be an issue, it's when my diesel prices are up, and then when inflation abates, my diesel prices are down, and I'm just seeing this direct correlation between oil prices and inflation again now.
Yeah, oil's a big component of the basket. It's such a critical input into so many supply chains. So there are certain goods and services that almost inevitably cause inflation growth in other products. Things like fertilizer, energy, oil, these sorts of things. When they go up, everything goes up. Oil factors into, for example, all freight across the country. So that will immediately impact all the food prices because it's more expensive to get food from farms to cities or to distribution centres. It's going to impact the cost of running an ambulance service.
I also heard the other day that the amount of oil used by these mega freight liners transporting containers uses a huge proportion of the oil used worldwide. In a more globalized world where everything is being shipped around the world, if they're using huge amounts of oil, then that means, again, the price of everything goes up.
Yes, absolutely. And because Australia's consumption of goods is becoming quite international, particularly in, electronics and things like that, we are getting hit not just by domestic issues, it's also international. So
what is driving up the price of oil at the moment?
So a lot of it is to do with sanctions on Russia. A lot of countries have essentially put up embargoes on Russian oil. Russia is one of the world's largest oil producers and has some of the largest untapped deposits. So when the international community essentially says we're not importing Russian oil anymore, that's a sanction on Russia. But the irony is that it actually hits the international market pretty hard as well.
It's a bit of blowback.
Yeah, it is. It certainly hurts Russia worse, though, having some of their largest export sources being turned off. But this is kind of the opposite situation to what happened in the 70s, which is this is a buyer's embargo, whereas in the 70s it was a seller's embargo. It was the OPEC states saying that anyone who supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War in the late 60s and the next one in the early 70s, we're going to embargo oil sales to them. So that leads to the oil shock.
Right. But it's all politics, isn't it?
It is all politics, surprise, surprise. It's either a natural disaster or it's a political decision.
And we're still on the supply side here.
Yeah, that's right. So, Australia's had about 4 or 5 major inflation events throughout the last 50 years, and they're essentially all caused by wars. And wars are, they're political events. They cause supply shortages for all sorts of reasons.
With Australia, we are a petro state. We do produce a lot of oil. So what you're saying is that even though we produce oil and we can use that domestically, we're importing that price rise from the international prices on oil.
Absolutely. It's a globalised enough world that you very rarely get inflation in certain parts of the world and it doesn't trickle across to everywhere else. So, you're going to get less and less a disparity between inflation in certain countries and the rest of the world as once was the case. That's sort of a reflection of how interlocked our supply chains are. So we are importing inflation all the time. We import a lot of inflation in terms of energy, in terms of fertilizer, in terms of oil.
I've seen a fair bit of debate at the moment about how much of the current inflation is a result of profit gouging. which is where the suppliers or the businesses can take advantage of the situation and start raising their prices, even though their costs are not rising. So I was wondering what you can tell us about profit gouging and how we even figure out how much of the inflation we can say is caused by profit gouging.
There's various surveys that the Bureau of Statistics runs, for example, on company profits versus input costs. So there is a quarterly business indicator survey which releases key indicators on the profits that different industries are making. So you can generally make a pretty good assessment of whether an industry is raising prices to meet its needs, meeting its bottom line, or whether it's taking advantage of a situation to make a bit of money. So this term profit gouging can refer to a whole range of behaviours. I came across a term excuseflation, which is basically where companies say, oh, well, we're raising our prices because everyone's doing it. We're in an inflation episode, so of course we're going to rise prices. But it's a smokescreen. As I was saying before, there's such disparity in the bottom lines of different industries and businesses that only passes the sniff test if you kind of haven't really thought about it very much.
I'm James Juniper. I'm an economist at the University of Newcastle, and you're listening to Radio 3CR.
So I get why people would think that inflation is just this monolithic one single number, because, in the news, what you do hear is just this number. And what Andy is saying is that that's just the general inflation figure. And you can get inflation in different goods going in different directions and in different sectors. So if bananas are not a central part of your diet, Kevin, the banana inflation of 2011 would not have affected you.
What I found interesting, what Andy said there, was that a supply-side inflation episode such as we're having at the moment leads to a fairly scattered approach to items in the inflation basket. Some go up, some go down. Whereas a demand side, which is to say that if there was extra money injected into the economy by the government through tax relief, etc., that it leads to sellers' inflation, where if sellers understand that there's more money available, they'll put their prices up regardless of the input costs.
Yeah, it's really interesting that these data analysts can look at the numbers and the numbers will tell them where the inflation is coming from because the numbers have these different patterns.
What occurs to me with the sellers' inflation is that undermines the whole free market ideology.
This whole thing that markets will clear.
The markets will clear, that they will find their balance. What that tells you is that the market will rip you off at any given opportunity, and that this whole thing about a method of equilibrium is complete shit, and I think it is.
Kevin's law of market rip-off.
But this isn't some radical understanding. This is the accepted understanding of inflation. They say that if there's too much money in the economy, then prices will go up, acknowledging that sellers will rip you off. And yet at the same time, these same orthodox economists will tell you that equilibrium will occur because market forces will balance things out. No, they're not. They're just going to rip you off at every opportunity.
Well, this is why there's a big battle around it. So the battle around what's causing inflation, it does look like this debate between the supply side versus the demand side. And we will hear more about it in the next clip with Andy there. But I was just thinking about how I had asked Andy why it's so important to talk about inflation. And for me, the big part of the answer is this battle over the narrative, because you need to figure out who to blame. And as you say, do we blame the suppliers? Do we blame the businesses for doing their sellers' inflation? Or do we blame the government for doing too much spending? So it's a huge battle to figure out what your policy response is going to be.
There's a massive contradiction here with the orthodox economics, because when this latest inflation episode occurred, they went straight to pays and salaries and said, we can't have a wage spiral, the workers will force inflation up. And yet they seem to have no concern about sellers, are putting their prices up.
Yes.
There's all this focus on the workers. Don't put your price up, workers, because you'll cause inflation. But sellers, you go for your life. That's just natural, of course. You
So
know?
what we're saying here is this debate over inflation. It is one of the many battles in class warfare. So you've got to keep your ears pricked for what's really going on when commentators are talking about inflation.
Yeah. He's talking about oil, and I reckon one simple indicator of inflation is oil, diesel in particular. And there's talk of the oil price going up again over the next few months.
Mm-hmm.
Watch this space. I reckon if the price of oil goes up over the next few months, we'll have inflation rising, and you'll then have the RBA saying that they need to put up interest rates because people have got too much money in their pocket. Is their logic of it? When in fact it's just a supply side thing. And if they do that, that's going to get really messy.
Maybe we can take a break and then head into the next clip we have with Andy and our discussion around that terrible thing, inflation.
It sounds like a good idea. We'll have a quick break and then go straight into the next part of the interview.
There are many ways that you can keep up to date with 3CR news, events and programs. The 3CR website is a great spot to catch all your shows via audio on demand or scroll through our range of podcasts. It's also where you can sign up to our monthly newsletter, buy yourself a new t-shirt, or check out archival audio from past broadcasts. Of course, we're also on Twitter at 3CR and Instagram at 3CR Melbourne. But don't forget our mighty AM band. Catch us anytime on 855 AM. Keep in touch, 3cr.org.au.
Radio MMT.
On 3CR,
Between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m.
the second and fourth Friday of each month.
Radio MMT. If you like our show, subscribe to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
And you can find us through your favourite podcaster and give us lots of stars.
And or give us a like on Facebook, Twitter or YouTube.
Your support really helps.
Because if you're not liked on social media, you don't exist. You said that inflation tends to be the result of war or political decisions or natural disasters. Yet if you listen to the commentators from the 70s and again now, although they acknowledged that the oil was part of it, the issue that they saw was that the labour force was too unionised and that wages were largely responsible for the inflation episode, certainly of the 70s. That was when we saw a switch from post-Keynesian economic management to the introduction of neoliberalism.
I mean, it's not as though higher wages don't tend to lead to higher prices. There is a bit of a loop or a spiral between demand and supply side inflation that can happen. Sometimes it's referred to as wage inflation spiral. But I don't think there's ever been a case where the demand side has started that loop. In the 70s, it's the oil shock that instigated the need for higher wages.
Yeah, well, you're in good company there, I think, Andy, because I heard Warren Mosler say in an interview, and Warren is one of the co-founders of modern monetary theory, and he said he has never in his lifetime seen an inflationary episode caused by too much aggregate demand.
Yep.
So that demand side versus supply side debate, we're falling very heavily on the supply side.
Yeah, and I would be surprised if we ever did, because frankly, it would take a government that would want to be voted out in order for that to happen. It would essentially require a government that had no other interest than causing inflation, which I think most governments hopefully don't. So, demand side inflation is what's often blamed or it's scapegoated as something that causes inflation, like governments spending too much or wages going up too much. But there's never really been an event where that's been a trigger point. It's always a supply side impact that leads to either wages growing through unionised action or, as is more recently the case, where you don't have a strong union movement, you've got governments stepping in with things like job seeker, job keeper, these sorts of policies that inject spending into the economy. These deficits are only run because a supply side shock has occurred first.
I guess we're heading now into this question about what is causing the most recent bout of inflation. And I think this is another area of debate because, of course, you hear a lot of mainstream economists say that it was all that spending during the COVID lockdowns by the government, like the JobKeeper and the increase in the job seeker, as you were saying.
Yes.
So what we're saying is that no, that's not the cause of the current inflation.
I would say almost certainly not. I mean, JobKeeper was something that was rolled out in early 2020, and you didn't really see inflation start to hit levels around which they are now until 2 years later than that. So we know that JobKeeper and JobSeeker were policies where the spending was aimed at the portion of households that have the highest propensity to spend. In other words, that money would have been spent straight away. I don't think that any credible economist is saying that that money was stashed under people's beds until 2 years later they could come out and cause an inflation bomb.
I've got a couple of thoughts about the COVID spending. Like you say, if it was going to be inflationary, it would have been inflationary straight away, you would have thought.
Exactly.
And yet there was no inflation straight away. It happened a couple of years later. So either there was a lag or there was another reason for that inflation. And you and I would say that there was another reason.
That's right.
The other interesting thing that occurs to me about the COVID spending from the Morrison government was that some of it may have been used to pay down the private debt that people incurred during the Costello years when government spending was low and private debt blew out. I'd like to see the figures on it.
Yeah, look, it's always hard to sort of have a longitudinal look at how people's spending has, transitioned in and out of inflation periods. As you say, during Howard Costello, there was actually a negative, what's called a negative savings rate. So when we talk about the prosperity years, there was actually a negative amount of saving on average across all Australian households for a good 5 or so years. So yes, household debt certainly ballooned at that time, and it wasn't helped by the beginning of skyrocketing house prices. That's really when the household debt took off, and yes, you would hope that really some of that was paid off. JobKeeper, at the end of the day, when you actually look at the distributional figures, it only really increased the wages of very young people. So we're talking about under 25 on average got a wage rise because of JobKeeper. So I don't think that there's any mass paying off of debt. So I guess the point that you're teasing out here is that when the government makes a surplus, everyone else, the households pick up the tab. So where you had that 6.6% deficit, which is the largest in our history, in the COVID year, the intention of that was to help households, and it did. And it also caused no inflation in the process, or at least caused so little that it wasn't really even measurable, and inflation wasn't being talked about. In general, governments try to have a little bit of inflation. So most central banks around the world are tasked with having a small rate of positive inflation.
That's probably something which is worth pointing out, is because we're talking about inflation as if inflation is something unusual, but you're saying that there's a target range.
Yeah.
Like the Reserve Bank of Australia targets between 2 to 3% per year as their targeted inflation rate. So when we're talking about inflation, we're talking about inflation that goes beyond what the target rate is. And I think it's sort of important for people to understand that.
Why do we need a little bit of inflation? And I'm still very skeptical about this idea that we need any. And and that's because I heard Jerome Powell the other day say, when somebody asked him, why do you have a 2% target rate? And he said, well, that's so that we can have a 2% interest rate. And that's so we've got some ammunition by which we can lower interest rates if we want.
Look, there's probably as many takes on this as there are commentators, but in general, like the macroeconomic so-called orthodoxy view is that you don't want persistent deflation because people hoard currency. And the point of currency is that it's, in a free market society, supposed to stimulate trade, and trade is supposed to stimulate production.
Well, what's the dynamic there? What's going on there?
So say I know that this $10 bill, that in 2 years' time, this can buy me twice as much as it can now. What's my incentive to spend that money?
Oh, because prices are going down.
Because prices are going down.
Right.
So what's to stop me hoarding cash under my bed, saying, well, why would I spend it now when prices will be lower? And that's a challenge that Japan has had to deal with.
So then people stop spending throughout the whole economy on everything except essentials, I imagine. So they're hoarding money thinking, oh, I'll buy that house or that car or I'll go on that holiday 6 months later or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that would decrease your total aggregate demand, which means that businesses would start going out of business.
That's right.
Okay.
And if you aim for a zero, like a steady inflation rate, you're exposing yourself to it going backwards. So I suppose, 2 or 3% gives them some buffer.
Yeah. It's seen as a safe rate. It doesn't create, significant risks of things like poverty or shortage.
We've talked about this before, Anne.
I know, and I disagree with you.
Look, I'm not saying that this is. I agree with it, but my impression was that orthodox economists like to have what I call a forward lean on the economy, where if something is increasing in price due to a target rate of between 2 or 3%, they might think, "Oh, this is worth more now than it was before. I might sell it," and so that produces some activity.
Yeah, that's the same sort of principle. It makes people want to sell and it makes people want to buy. And that's supposed to stimulate trade and production. So this is why I say in a free market society, that's what you want. Now, in a centralized socialist type economy, you don't need an inflation rate. You're essentially centrally producing things, and technological advancement will mean that on average, people will have more stuff to have distributed amongst them every year. And that's essentially deflation. Or if you look at it on the flip side, it's a real wage increase.
If you had no inflation, wouldn't neoclassical equilibrium model work better?
Totally off
I'm
track now.
Drop that. This is my new theory, but we'll get into this.
Theory, and now I'm going to hear about it all the time.
Yeah. I'll explain it to you afterwards. It's off the track.
So you're saying a market economy likes to see inflation because supposedly we're stimulating all that market activity. In a centralised economy, government's setting the prices, I guess, and we don't worry about inflation too much, or deflation even.
So I guess the point is that even though they've got a positive inflation target, they're still aiming for positive real wage growth, even though inflation is aimed for 2 to 3%. Well, we want wages to be going up 4 to 5% so that every year their standard of living is still increasing, even though we've got this target range. I guess the complication comes when you can't reach that increased wage growth that you need to exceed inflation in order to get that real wage growth going up.
Right. So another thing that governments could be doing to help out the cost of living is supporting workers in their power to bargain.
Yep, absolutely. In a world where we have less unionisation, you don't have the demand pressures on inflation. So you tend to have governments filling the gap with direct subsidy. And yes, that causes inflation, but not all extra inflation driven by government spending is bad. So if, for example, the government were to double the unemployment benefit, of course you would get some inflation. But if you look at a distributional analysis of who's getting what, and that extra bit of inflation would mean that everyone else has a slight real wage decrease, but what you've got in net terms is an increase in equality. And the question is that worth it?
So what you're talking about there sounds like, you can use inflation as a redistribution mechanism.
Yeah, and, using inflation is always going to raise alarm bells for people. I'm not suggesting that we sort of wield it like a bat, but
no.
But what I'm saying is that, just because a government program is likely to cause inflation, it's too broad a statement to say that it must necessarily be bad and we shouldn't do it.
Right. Because there's always winners and losers, isn't there, with inflation?
Yeah, I think that the merits of the policy should be based on who are the winners and who are the so-called losers. There are certain policies that will cause inflation and be worse for those who are on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. Those are probably things that we should avoid in my view, but there are the policies that will increase inflation but increase real wages for the people that need it most, and that's arguably much more defensible. So while we're talking about whether or not government spending causes inflation, there's also the other side of the argument, which is that even if it does cause inflation, is it a kind of inflation that we can justify?
Is it a terrible thing? Interesting. That argument about whether government spending causes inflation, I feel like it's one of two arguments that just don't go away. And the other argument is government spending creating a debt that we need to pay back and therefore we need to stop spending? And then the other argument is government spending causing inflation and therefore we need to stop spending? So it seems to me like these are the two zombie arguments that just won't go away because somebody out there just doesn't like government spending.
Yeah, you'll always have people that don't.
They're called neoliberals. They're called neoliberal fascist bastards.
That would be the editorial side of this conversation.
Yep.
Can't help myself sometimes.
You can't, can you? Well, if anyone tries to tell you that the government shouldn't spend because it will cause inflation, you can tell them that a data analyst on Radio MMT said it's very unlikely that will cause demand-side inflation.
Yeah, it's always a smokescreen, isn't it? It's part of this neoliberal misinformation program that came from the 70s, all driven by the private sector, saying the private sector needs to do everything and the government can't spend. If the government spends, it causes inflation. If the private sector spends, it's all okay.
Exactly.
Well, what happens when the private sector are running the oil companies and they put the price up? That's clearly a private sector caused inflation,
So the takeaway from this is that when you hear people talk about the supply side inflation, that's like code for blaming the businesses, which we should do.
Yep.
And then if people are talking about demand side inflation, that's like code for either blame the workers for wanting increased wages or code for the government's been spending too much. And the problem with that story taking off is that we need to see the government spending in the near future, because we've got to do a big spend on dealing with climate change, and we've got to do a big spend on the housing crisis and so on.
The NDIS is growing and growing, and this is a good thing. And I reckon the NDIS has many similar attributes to the job guarantee.
Yes. So it's the spending that we need to see. And as you said, this idea that government spending is the problem took off in the 1970s, and that goes back to our arch nemesis, Milton Friedman. And he brought out this idea of this quantity theory of money, which is what he based his school of economics called monetarism on. Ah, yes, the quantity theory of money. We should have a go at explaining the quantity theory of money, just to show how defective the reasoning of mainstream economics can be. So the quantity theory of money was Milton Friedman's invention. And it sort of is telling us that the more reserves you have in the economy, which is to say the more money that the commercial banks have in their accounts at the central bank, then the more inflation you're going to get. In which case, since the central bank determines the supply of reserves in the economy, then the central bank should be the one limiting inflation. And of course, this is also wrong, because the central bank does not determine the supply of reserves by determining the supply of loans in the economy. It cannot control that. So what Milton Friedman did is he took an accounting identity and he wrangled it into his quantity theory of money. And an accounting identity is simply something that says, for example, 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 1 plus 3 equals 4. Therefore, 2 plus 2 and 1 plus 3 must be equal. So there's nothing controversial about that, nothing anyone is arguing about there. So this very simple accounting identity, and it might help if you get a pen and paper at this point. It's a simple formula. We don't often do mathematics on this show, but this one's fairly simple. And the formula is that the supply of money, or the amount of dollars in the economy, multiplied by the velocity of money, which is the average times each dollar gets spent or used in a transaction, equals the average price of goods and services multiplied by the total quantity of goods and services sold during whatever time period we're looking at. So the formula you want to write down is M, which stands for money, multiplied by V, which stands for velocity, equals P, which stands for price, multiplied by Y, which they use to stand for quantity. So how this looks is, for example, if you had an economy that sold 100 hamburgers that year, and each hamburger sold for $10, what was the total amount of hamburger transactions that took place in your economy? Well, it would be 100 hamburgers multiplied by $10, which equals $1,000 worth of hamburgers. Now, if that same economy has 200 $1 bills to use in these sales of hamburgers, how many times was each dollar used? Well, you just divide the $200 bills into the $1,000 worth of hamburgers, and we can see that that goes 5 times. So that means the velocity was 5. So what we're saying is 10 times 100 equals 200 by 5. Nothing anyone can argue about there. But Milton Friedman took this innocent accounting identity and he did a terrible thing with it. What did he do? He made some assumptions that would help him get to a very specific conclusion. So Milton thought to himself, he said, what if all these numbers, the velocity, the price, etc., what if they all stayed the same, but one of the numbers changed? Then we could blame that number for the economy getting out of whack. So Milton was able to tell us that it's the M, or the supply of money, that gets out of whack by making all these assumptions about the V, the P and the Y. So of the velocity of money, which he said comes down to people's spending habits, he said, well, those are pretty constant because they're based on things like regular paychecks, as if we all have regular income. He said the price stays the same due to competition, so that sellers and buyers reach this equilibrium of price, this mythical equilibrium that they're always talking about. And he said the Y, or the quantity of stuff in the economy, the amount of hamburgers we have, always stays the same because we're going to assume the economy is in full employment. That means the economy is at full capacity, and so how many hamburgers you're making won't go up or down. And he also said the money would stay the same because people's savings stay the same. But unfortunately, the government steps in, the irresponsible government, and he was pointing the finger at the central bank in this case. They come along and put all this extra money into the economy. And when they do that, because people have more money, they spend more money. And because they spend more money and there's no extra hamburgers, all they're doing is pushing up the prices of hamburgers. This formula leads to all sorts of crazy ideas. For example, if it's the central bank that is increasing the money supply when it really shouldn't be, and of course we know that it's the central bank is not controlling the money supply at all, but he thought it was. And he thought that's because they're listening to the politicians, so we should make the central bank independent from politicians. And that's one of the main things that modern monetary theory does, is it folds the central bank back into its role, pretty much simply the cash register for the government. In other words, the cash register for the Treasury. So if the Parliament is instructing the Treasury, which instructs the central bank as we see it, then we do need to look at those parliamentary decisions to see whether they're causing inflation. And that's why we keep saying this demand side, or the injection of money into the economy, or this spending by the federal government, it has almost never been the trigger for an inflationary episode, including what we're living through today. Even though those mainstream economists want to point at the spending that the government did during the COVID lockdowns, and they'll say, well, 2 years after you did that spending, we got inflation, so that spending must have caused inflation. So they're hiding behind the skirts of Milton Friedman when they say that.
I reckon the quantity theory of money is an absolute perler of a theory that just chooses the bare facts that make it work and then disregards everything else.
That's right.
It's not like the sellers would put their prices up, or anything like that. They're always going to be fair and reasonable. And there's no such thing as climate change or wars or.
And no reasonable economist believes any of this anymore. But it makes a really good tool for the ideologues to get out there and say the government shouldn't be spending.
In simple terms, I'm just going to give you an example of this. It's as if saying that if you've got $50 in your pocket and you go shopping and you want to buy 5 shirts, that you're going to spend $10 each. And what they're saying is that if you've got $100 in your pocket, you're going to go into that same shop and you're going to voluntarily give twice the money for that shirt because you've got twice the amount of money.
Yeah.
Which is just such a...
Or they're saying you only want 5 shirts, but you're going to go and buy 10 shirts just because you've got the money.
Well, not even by 10. What they're saying is if a shirt costs $10 each because you've got $50 in your pocket and you want 5 of them, and now you've got $100, you're going to give $20 to this.
That money's going to be spent.
Because it's like the disregarded that maybe you'll save it, or maybe there might be 2 shops that sell and one will keep their price down. Like all of that's just disregarded in this formula.
Yeah, there's nothing reasonable or rational about it.
There's nothing nuanced at all in it.
But he was able to get away with all this because the mainstream economists of the day, or the Keynesians of the day, they couldn't explain that oil shock that was happening in the 1970s. So Milton stepped in with his little quantity theory of money and waved it around.
And that's what we're going to do when the next crisis happens. We're sitting here, us MMTers.
We're not going to let them get away with it.
We're going to learn from their strategies.
And there was a recent example of what this supply side versus demand side debate looks like, and that was on the March 11 episode of the ABC's television show Q&A, and MMT economist Stephanie Kelton was on the panel there, doing her best to describe the supply side causes of the current inflation. But then fellow panellists and former Australian Financial Review columnist Joe Aston went to say that the RBA, so he was quoting the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, saying that demand counted for 1/3 to a half of the recent inflation. Well, okay, even if you take that at face value, you flip it around, and the RBA was saying that the supply was accounting for 1/2 to 2/3 of the inflation.
Welcome to Q&A. Tonight, a panel of economic heavy hitters are here to answer your questions.
But 100% of the inflation was not supply side.
No, but everyone who's looked at this, at least in the US context, look at people who've done the autopsy, that go back and really do detailed analysis and say, where did this inflation come from that we've experienced over the course of the last 3 years or so? It came from the supply side. It came from the bottlenecks in production, and later from the war in Ukraine and Russia. It came from energy and food prices. Look, we haven't even talked about the price gouging. Corporations took advantage of the inflationary environment. They raised prices, so some of it came from there, but very little of the inflation, for those who've actually done the work and tried to explain it, will say that it came from governments just simply spending too much.
The RBA in Australia said that they modelled it in different ways, but between 1/3 and 1/2 of the inflation outbreak in Australia was demand side. And printing more money causes inflation.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. No.
So that's just very typical of what the debate looks like in the mainstream media.
Yeah, and what always gets me is that even the Reserve Bank identified the latest round of inflation as a supply-side problem and then provided a demand-side solution. And as we said earlier on, very few inflation episodes are caused by demand side. They're generally always caused by supply side. And even if they were demand side, even if everybody got a pay rise and they went out spending more, what they're essentially going to do is put pressure on the supply side again. So a demand side driven inflation episode, not that I've ever heard of one, will result in a supply side problem. So inflation is nearly always a supply side issue.
Exactly. And so this supply side, I love that excuseflation or greedflation to describe what's going on with the price gouging. So you can see what's at stake in this debate. Like, you can see why they're trying to get away with blaming the raising of the job seeker at one point, so that they can use this to argue against increasing the pay rate for unemployment benefits. So this is what's at stake in winning this narrative.
You know, it's always a disguise. All of these conversations are nearly always a disguise to put downward pressure on wages. It's like if a seller puts their price up because they think that there's more money in the economy to extract, that's seen as being a shrewd business person who is maximising your capability. If a worker says that when they want to put their wages up because there's more money in the economy because the business is doing well, they're told that they're a bloody communist and they should get back in their box, and we need to have some sort of regulation over wage spiral inflation and call in the cops and lock them up.
Before you blow a gasket over there, Kevin, shall we head to our last clip with Andy?
Yes, let's do that now. I'll give you a solution, and this runs to the heart of MMT and how being worried about deficits restricts policy. Now, if there's a fuel-induced inflation episode, as we've just had, if the government came in and subsidised the fuel price so that it stayed low, your inflation episode would be dramatically reduced. But that would require the government to run a so-called deficit, which nobody's going to endorse because they regard deficits as bad. And yet that would have been a very simple step to address inflation. Rather than raising interest rates, they could have subsidised fuel. Inflation would have had much less of an impact.
Yeah. And we've already seen policies that do basically the same thing for a whole range of mainly services. So think back to free university. Think more recently to subsidised childcare or free in kindergarten in Victoria's case. These are all cases of a government saying, well, we have a price problem, we have a cost of living problem. We're going to do something to change that. And in all cases, well, guess what? CPI dropped dramatically in those categories and took the whole average inflation down with it. So yes, government spending can and does directly reduce inflation. The sort of story that we hear is that, somewhere in the long term, the boogeymen are going to come out and that money is going to somehow come up and bite us in the bum. But when you look at history and historical spending patterns in the so-called business cycle, it's very hard to notice any correlation between deficit spending and subsequent inflation, even if you're talking about 1 year, 2 years, up to 5 years after any significant deficit. You don't really see any pattern. And that's usually because the deficit spending that's done is productive spending. In other words, it's there to increase production. And so you offset that demand increase with a supply increase. And that means that inflation is kept under control. So, yes, I think there should be a proactive approach towards subsidising goods and services that are experiencing inflation. We did have a fuel excise sort of holiday during COVID. There was a lot of debate about when that should be removed. But all of these things have clear and immediate cost of living relief impacts. And not a lot of people complain when we do them. There's a lot of commentary before we do them that we shouldn't do them. And then once they're there, people revolt in the streets when we try to remove them. So
that is such a counterintuitive point, though. I remember hearing that during the lockdowns, that when the Morrison Coalition government introduced free universal childcare, that it was actually deflationary, even though they were doing all this increased spending. Can you explain what that dynamic is? Because I'm sure most people would think, they were spending more, therefore we had to have been increasing prices.
That's right. There's a really important point here about a lot of these subsidy programs also come with price controls, and price controls are very important. So ultimately CPI and inflation is about prices, and the most direct way to stop inflation is to simply stop businesses raising prices.
You're starting to sound like Isabella Weber there.
Correct. Yes. And now, without sounding authoritarian, that is the most direct way of addressing inflation, is to simply say that we can control prices as a government.
It has been done before. These were policies that were introduced during World War II. So if you have a look at the amount of spending done during World War II, and you've also got short supply because of massive disruption to supply chains, etc.
Yeah, so in the case of, for example, childcare subsidies, you have restrictions with that, and similar to NDIS programs, there are price audits on businesses to make sure that they're not just passing on the subsidy into their prices and saying, we know people can pay for these things, so we're just going to increase the cost because part of the tab's been picked up by the government. If you don't have those price controls, then yes, you probably will see inflation, because businesses are going to say, well, okay, we're just going to put up prices until people are paying what they were before. Now, if you have those price controls, then suddenly you're taking that price off households through the subsidy in a way that's guaranteed to flow through to consumers. Then, of course, CPI goes down. Yes, capping prices does control CPI. It's at the heart of some of the most popular and effective policies that we've had in recent times. But it's a lot of the hyperventilating in the lead up that often tests the will of government to try these things. But that is the only thing that actually drops inflation quickly.
So is that what was going on with the childcare provision during the lockdowns, is they had price controls on that?
That's right. So we've done this many, many times because, frankly, we know it's ineffective when it doesn't happen. For example, there's a lot of debate around the stamp duty exemptions as a way of reducing house prices, and people rightly commented that, well, people are going to put up the cost of their house if they know that people don't have to pay stamp duty.
Right. They got an extra $10,000 or something.
So that's an example where you have an attempt to reduce the cost of living and where you may actually increase it. And that's what people are afraid of. But when you've got that price control, then suddenly it reduces the price. Now,
Right.
the question is, what's the longer term impact when those price controls inevitably get removed, because we do live in a free market society? Is that increased amount of money sloshing around going to lead to some sort of inflation? Or, well, the measurements say no. Like we've been measuring CPI for 75 years now. Like, this would have come up somewhere. And you look at, we've run a lot of deficits over the years. There's simply no discernible longer term impact of price controlled subsidy programs that are funded by deficits. The evidence just isn't there.
Well, while we're on the topic of what we can do to help people by lowering the cost of living, are you aware of any other techniques aside from, a lot of the MMT economists, I hear them talk about universal basic services as a way of helping out with the cost of living. So we're talking about not just a universal subsidised childcare, but also healthcare and dental care and probably housing and so on. So that's one way of helping everyone to deal with the cost of living. Do you know of any other approaches?
You have subsidies, which is paying for part of a good or service by a government. Benefits, which is basically just giving money to certain eligible households. You've got price controls, and you've also got various other supply side policies, which are often a bit more complicated and political and difficult to implement. Things like reservation policies, things like protectionism, putting tariffs on trade, for example, to try and keep more of Australia's gas or grain on shore, because we've got spiralling prices in things like gas and wheat that we produce in droves, but we export the vast majority of, and therefore we create scarcity for people living here. So, for example, WA has a gas reservation policy, which means that there's a certain proportion of its gas kept for locals. And it means that the locals pay a much lower price for their gas than everyone else.
So it's getting control of your export industry.
Yeah, so that's the supply side control.
That sounds socialist to me. That sounds like a bunch of commies over in Western Australia.
Yeah, that's what we associate them with.
Yeah, that's West Australian commies. I've heard them say that what we need to do also is boost our productivity. So again, that's supply side.
Yeah.
And what I've heard some of the economists say is, okay, in that case, we need to build the skills and education of our workforce. So that's a bit of a longer term view, I guess.
Yeah.
And invest in R&D. And again, that would be government spending, deficit spending probably.
Yeah, it is. Productivity, reduced CPI, we have pretty clear data to back this up. So there have been a lot of categories of CPI that, believe it or not, have been going down persistently for years. And, if people looked at that sort of spread of products, they'll see that certain things always go down. Things like communications, internet, data, clothing as well, because production prices are going down. These things have been decreasing in price for a long time.
Solar panels, renewable energy, that's going down.
Yep. That's right. So a whole range of things where technological improvements have led to sort of realisable benefits to production, their prices have been going down systematically. So in theory, in a world which is getting more and more technologically advanced, we should be seeing price pressures downwards because of increased productivity.
Still blows my mind, Kevin, that when the government spends, if it spends in a certain way, it can actually lower inflation, not increase inflation.
But we've got to get over that hump where it's just jumped into you, where we're told that government spending causes inflation. And yet what we find out is that the orthodoxy is completely arse about.
Just goes to show how indoctrinated we've all been by good old Milton Friedman's quantity theory of money.
Yeah.
And of course, the lesson here is if you're going to do subsidies, then you need to put a cap on the prices, which sounds like a bit of centralised planning.
That's called red tape regulation, Anne.
That's the red tape. Well, it's jolly good news for those who want to see universal basic services, because think about that.
Yeah.
If we were to subsidise dental care and have universal dental care, I mean, we could actually lower inflation.
Yeah. You could tie the rebates to dental, as you could do with doctors as well, and say you get a rebate so long as you don't charge over a certain price. And if you start inflating your price, then we're going to regulate you back into the right area again.
Exactly. So Andy took us on a tour there of the causes and the solutions to inflation. So we know what to do. And in the next episode of Radio MMT, we'll hear more from Andy about how the government is currently dealing with inflation and how it could do better. And we will also hear about Andy's story of his own family experiencing the hyperinflationary episode in Yugoslavia. And I do love a good hyperinflation story, Kevin, because the numbers, they become so unhinged.
Speaking of numbers, I did mention Japan earlier in the show.
Oh, yes.
And so Japan is experiencing some inflation, and it's also raised its interest rates from negative to zero at the moment, right? They tried a negative interest rate experiment, and they've now raised the rates to zero. And what we can find from Japan is that they didn't raise interest rates. They had some inflation, but their inflation was less than the Western countries. So they imported inflation because oil prices went up.
Right,
so it
like
wasn't
we all did. Yep.
Yeah, so it wasn't an internal inflation episode. It came from the outside world upon which they are reliant. But their inflation was less because raising interest rates adds to inflation. That's the lesson you can take from that. That's very simplistic. You need more analysis of it. But we've seen how, time and time again, if the government introduces, if the RBA introduces a rate that makes life more expensive, it pushes prices up, it adds to inflation.
Kind of logical, isn't it?
Yeah, nuts. Anyway, Mafalda's coming up next.
Yes,
Do we have
don't
anything else?
forget, save the date, 20th of April, next Saturday. We are holding an event called Beyond Finding the Money, which is a sort of informal event, because we'll just have a bunch of us who are not economists yet.
No. Some of us never will be. I've decided never to become an economist.
We're never going to become economists, but we are very enthusiastic amateurs. We reckon if we can understand this stuff, anyone can.
Yeah.
So the details of that event will be at spag.au. SPAG stands for our name, Sustainable Prosperity Action Group. And we'll see you in the city at Torrens University.
Catch you then, and see you in 2 weeks' time, Anne.
See you then. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radioMMT@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get musical.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.